Now that we have completed the cast on, we have our 20 stitches on the needle. We are going to start on the first section of the sampler scarf, the cast onto cables pattern, and that is to create garter stitch. That is done by knitting every stitch of every row. So we're going to get started with the knit stitch. To do the knit stitch, you are going to do 4 steps very similar to when we cast on. The first 3 steps are actually going to be identical to the cast on. So, step 1, we take our right hand needle and we put it through the loop on the left needle. Step 2, we take our yarn, again making sure it's the end that comes from our ball of yarn, that we're not using our tail. For at the beginning of this row, our tail will actually be at the other end, so it's not so likely to accidentally grab it, but at the beginning of the next row, it'll be important that we make sure that we're using the correct end of the yarn. So step 1, we put our right hand needle in. Step 2, we lay the yarn across that underneath needle. Step 3, we take that new strand of yarn that we just laid across and pull it through to the front. The only difference between casting on and the knit stitch happens right here. With the cast on, we take that new loop we just created on our right needle and we put it back on the left needle. For the knit stitch, we are going to keep that brand new stitch that we just created on our right hand needle. We're going to keep it on the right hand needle, so I actually choose to put my finger on top of it. That way it doesn't accidentally jump off when I don't want it to. And we're going to take the loop on our left hand needle and we're going to push that off into the air. And we're going to do those exact same 4 steps again. This time we've got a stitch on our right needle, but we don't do anything differently because of that. So step 1, we put our right hand needle in. Step 2, we lay the yarn across. Step 3, we pull that loop through to the front. And again, the loop we just created on our right hand needle stays there, so I put my fingers on top so they don't accidentally jump off. And the loop on our left needle does jump off into the air. That is how you do a knit stitch. And for creating garter stitch, where we just knit every stitch of every row, we are simply going to be knitting all the way across, doing those knit stitches on every loop of yarn all the way across. I will say that I have been knitting for about 20 years now, so if your knit stitches do not look as fast or as smooth as mine, that's okay. Give it 20 years. It does just take practice to get much more comfortable doing the knit stitches, and that's all right. The only way to get there is to practice more. We're going to knit all the way across, knitting each stitch one at a time, and so you're transferring one stitch at a time from the left hand needle onto the right hand needle. So every stitch we have one fewer on the left needle and one more on the right needle. When we get to the very last stitch on our needle, we're going to treat this very last stitch identical to every other stitch. So step 1, needle goes in, step 2, yarn goes across, step 3, we pull that loop through, and step 4, that last loop comes off the left needle. So we now have a totally empty left hand needle, and we have all of our stitches on the right needle. At the end of a row, especially when you're first getting started knitting, I kind of like to pull and tug a little bit to make everything look neat and tidy at the bottom. I think this helps to be able to see that you've finished your first row and everything is looking how it's supposed to. One common issue that people have when they're getting started is what's called gauge or tension, and that means some of the stitches you're pulling a little bit tighter and some you're pulling a little bit looser, and that will make things look a little bit uneven on your needle, and that is okay. There's not a problem with that. As long as nothing is unraveling with your work, you're doing everything correctly. So that is completing your very first row of knitting, and to start your second row of knitting, you are simply going to switch hands. You're going to take the needle that has all the loops on it that was in your right hand, and you're going to put that into your left hand. You're going to pick up the needle, the empty needle that was in your left hand, and put it in your right hand. And now we are going to begin the exact same thing again. We are going to knit all the way across the stitches a second time. This time, because both tails are in the same place, you want to make sure that you are not using the tail, the short end of yarn, and that you're using the end connected to your ball. And we are going to start the exact same thing. We're going to take that right hand needle and poke it through the stitch from front to back. Step 2, lay the yarn across. Step 3, pull that loop through. Step 4, push it off. And we are just going to knit to the end of this row as well. And this pattern tells us how many rows to do of our knitting, and that's how many rows that you're going to do. You're going to, every time you get to the end of a needle, you have completed 1 row of knitting. The cast on does not count as a row. So you are going to cast on your stitches, and then the pattern tells you to work your 34 rows of knitting. You are going to do 34 rows after the cast on. And there are a lot of ways to keep track of how many rows that you've done. One way is to make tally marks on the piece of paper if you're a paper copy pattern kind of a person. There are a lot of apps that you can get for your phone or tablet that will keep track as well. Or you can use row counters, little devices that slide onto your needles themselves that you can turn to keep track of what number row that you're on. And that is how we are going to work the garter stitch pattern.